morning and welcome back to the lecture series on refugee migration diaspora. So, today we are going to study hybrid identity through two artworks basically. One is a short story by Jhumpa Lahiri called Mrs. Sen, and then Shani Muthu's Out on Main Street. These are the two works we are considering today in order to understand the concept of hybrid identity in diaspora. So, Out on Main Street is the first short fiction publication by the Indo-Trinidadian Canadian writer Shani Muthu. Out on Main Street is a collection of 9 stories with origins that trace back to the Caribbean as well as the Canadian, the diasporic as well as the continental. So, we see that identity, the question of identity here becomes something very layered, very complex, and cannot be straitjacketed. Muthu's epigraph to the collection, it remains unattributed. However, one can presume that it is her own quotation. It admonishes against the broad sweep of nostalgic generalizations. So, this is how Muthu's epigraph goes. Which of us here can possibly know the intimacies of each other's cupboards back home, or in which hard to reach corners dust balls used to collect? So, here we are talking about some very personalized emotions which are like the dust balls collected, in the corner of our mind, in the corner of the human psyche, something that cannot be invaded by the outer world. Unless it is exposed by the person, unless it is actually recounted or narrated by the person. It is talking about certain niche identity, niche experiences, and this is understood in contrast with the diasporan space, in contrast with the new land where a character is made to, resettle or find a new life. Shani Muthu is an author, a visual artist and video maker. She was born in Ireland to a Trinidadian family. She grew up in Trinidad and relocated at the age of 19 to Vancouver, Canada. Currently, she lives in Ontario in Canada. Muthu's writings have reflected her own lived experiences, which shuffle or play around with her own indentured identity, as well as describes growing up in a multicultural Canada. So, we see that Shani Muthu, the writer and artist, has a very layered, nuanced identity, and she is, through her writing, she is talking about this, complex persons, this complex existence that she is in a new land, in a foreign land. So, an important review by Novel Niche in 2010 says, I quote, "It seems more likely that her remembrances of Trinidadian rituals, customs, and rites, specifically those pertinent to religious and cultural Indo-Trinidadian minutiae, are infused with the startling, though not unwelcome, presence and immediacy of Canada." So, we see that these 3 countries with which, Muthu in a way shares her roots, she traces her roots to 3 different countries, and they somehow are interspersed, they come together to shape her experiences, to make her who she is in the current time. And they actually have a deep influence in her writings. So, we see that when she is recounting about the Trinidadian rituals and rites, especially the ones that are pertinent to her Indo-Trinidadian minutiae, she cannot really decouple these aspects from the presence and immediacy of Canada. Her Indo-Trinidadian self cannot be really divorced from or, separated from her Canadian experience, her self as, part of Canada. These different layers of her identity are very closely interlinked. Since 1971, Canada has been implementing the policy of multiculturalism, which is outlined in the Canadian Multiculturalism Act of 1988. This act aims at recognizing and promoting the understanding that multiculturalism reflects the cultural and racial diversity of Canadian society and acknowledges the freedom of all members of Canadian society to preserve, enhance, and share their cultural heritage. Unquote. Shanimoto's collection of short stories out on Main Street begins with the following sentence. It's written completely in broken English, but still we can find some sense in it. There is an immediate identification as an Indian reader. So this is how it goes. Me and Janet, we does go Main Street to see pretty sari and bangle, and to eat we bellyful a burfi and gulab jamun. But we do go too often because you see, is them sweet self what give people like we a presupposition for untamable hip and thigh. It's completely broken English. We can see that a lot of people who arrive in America and Canada and do not have proficiency of English, they speak in similar manner. So there is an immediate connection, identification with this kind of a language. She is probably talking about a lane which is occupied, inhabited by the Indians primarily. It actually displays pretty saris and bangles and burfis and jamuns, she's talking about eating those sweets and consequently developing more cumbersome, probably a more corpulent body as a result. So the opening sentence immediately transports the readers to a multicultural street in Canada. The central theme that pervades Mutu's stories include colonialism, migration, diaspora, multiculturalism, racism, and ambiguous sexuality. So her stories are interested in the hybridist conditions of the world beyond, any reconciliation. It's difficult, almost impossible to claim any kind of purity in terms of one's identity anymore. The title of the story is also uniquely written in the patois of Caribbean Indian dialect. So the dialect is not only broken English, it reminds one of the Caribbean Indian dialect. It offers a narrative style that may initially unsettle the reader. So the expectation of English that the reader brings to table is thwarted, is frustrated. However, as the reader immerses in the language, they are transported into the world of the narrator and her lover Janet. So the narrator and her lover Janet make a Trinidadian Indian lesbian couple. They are a lesbian couple. In the title story out on Main Street, the narrator and Janet are shopping on the main street of the Indian Quarter in Vancouver, Canada. In the sweet shop run by Fijian Indians, we see, as the narrator portrays, the pronunciation and accents that the narrator and her lover have, this couple have, are treated with contempt, with derision by the shop owner, right? So on the one hand, we have the Trinidadian Indians that this couple is, Janet and her, and the narrator, they are Trinidadian Indians. And when they speak English, they are derided, they are looked down upon by the Fijian Indian shop owner. Why? Because the Fijian Indians feel in this case that their Indianness is superior as compared to the Trinidadian Indians. Their Indian background is more authentic. So the question of authenticity, the question of superiority in the diaspora arises even as we see that these are people originally from India they trace their roots, their ancestry to Indian culture. But then the question of superior and inferior, better and worse, lesser or greater, this kinds of gradations, value additions are coming in. So the Fijian Indian shop owner looks down on the Trinidadian Indian couple, lesbian couple, because of the way they speak their English. The narrator says, "We is watered down Indians. We ain't good grade A Indians." So, Indianness is also graded once they are placed in a diasporan space. Indianness is not quite the same, but depending on one's background, the way one speaks English, one ought to, be identified as grade A or grade B Indian. So, they are the watered down Indians as Trinidadian Indians. The narrator further says, "We skin brown is true, but we don't even think about India unless something happens over there and it comes on the news. Me family remain Hindu ever since me ancestors leave India behind, but nowadays they do believe in praying unless things real bad, because as me father always singing, like if it is a mantra, do good and good will be bestowed unto you. Mostly back home, we as kitchen Indians, some kind Indian food every day, at least once a day." And this goes on. So we see that Indianness is retained in terms of certain wise sayings by the father and in terms of the culinary habits. So every day they're cooking at least one Indian dish as a way of, maintaining connection to their roots. The narrator challenges the notions of cultural purity with regard to her family and calls her family as watered down kitchen Indians. We are kitchen Indians because our Indianness has remained restricted to our kitchen practices, our, the recipe of food that we still retain back from India. They are neither quite Indian nor something else altogether. And this reflects the hybridity, the layeredness, the complexity of their identity, which cannot be reduced to, which cannot be straitjacketed down to something very simplified or rather oversimplified. Muthu further questions cultural identity and purity. The story unfolds that the narrator's family remained Hindu. However, Janet's family converts to Presbyterianism, so they become Christians. According to Ashwin R. Kinney, it is a text that theorizes diaspora queerly to critique the essentialism of diasporic nationalisms and imagine queer feminist modes of affiliation and collectivity that resist the beckoning call of exclusionary nationalisms. So, this narrator is displaced from any kind of exclusionary, heteronormative, patriarchal notion of nationalism, both in terms of her ethnicity. She's, displaced twice over. She's, once an Indian, then moving to Trinidad, and then finally to Canada. So many layers to her identity. And to make it more complicated, she's a lesbian. In terms of her sexual orientation, she is further displaced from the mainstream. So she in no way actually features in what can be called as a exclusionary heteronormative nationalism. The story presents the complexities within the characters of the story as different ethnic groups. It could be drunken Caucasian men and straight Indian women enter the shop. So complexities start emerging as people from different backgrounds are entering the shop. Muthu examines the prejudice and shifting allegiances brought about when people feel threatened by anything that does not meet their own cultural and sexual norms. Here she explores the nuances of culture in order to reflect that culture is not a static phenomenon. And this is something we have been talking about in our other lectures too. The fact that culture is not a static phenomenon and that it is possible to forge an identity from multiple and eclectic cultural elements that can be incorporated into their identities. Our identities are constantly in motion. We are revising, revisiting, problematizing, adding, and subtracting elements into and from our identities. We are being constantly influenced from different multiple quarters, multiple sources, and we are constantly imbibing or incorporating new cultural elements, and that changes our identity. It can never be something a priori and constant across time and space. So, the above observation, the fact that our identity, our culture are all in motion and they're constantly being forged and refashioned through different eclectic cultural elements and influences. This observation is very much in synchronization with what we discussed in our earlier lecture, where we were quoting David Cameron as saying that it is important to build a stronger sense of national and local identity that holds the key to achieve true cohesion by allowing people to say, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Hindu, I'm a Christian, but at the end of the day, I'm a Londoner too. So if I live in London, over and above my other affinities, my other affiliations, I'm a Londoner too. So, coming back to Out on Main Street, the story is set in an Indian cafe which can be read as a space of intersection of various cultures within Canadian society. So, in this place called Kush Valley Sweets, people from different societal backgrounds come into touch with each other, and the cafe can therefore be termed as what Mary Louise Pratt would call as a contact zone. So, contact zone results from colonial encounters as the space in which people geographically and historically separated come into contact with each other and establish ongoing relations, usually involving conditions of coercion, radical inequality, and intractable conflict. So, contact zone is always a volatile zone. It is always fraught with problems, fraught with tension, because it's a meeting point of people from various backgrounds, and it's such an interface, such a meeting is hardly smooth. It leads to intractable conflicts, it leads to misunderstandings many times, conditions of coercions emerge, and relationships are never, ideal or equal. There is always a tendency of one person to or one group to dominate the other. This is what defines the volatile and problem ridden contact zone. That's what contact zone is. Apart from ethnic differences, the unnamed narrator in Out on Main Street hesitates to go out in the street also because of her sexual orientation. So, it's not only the factor of ethnic difference, but also her different sexual orientation. As a lesbian, her gender and sexuality intersect with her ethnic origin, which add to her further marginalization. It leads to a double marginalization from the public sphere, that is the street, because the street has been constructed as a predominantly heteronormative space. The narrator is aware that she is not welcomed in this little India on the Canadian streets because her very presence tends to disrupt and unsettle gender norms. In her study of the queer diasporic experience in a South Asian context, in the work Impossible Desires, the work is titled Impossible Desires, Queer Diasporas and South Asian Public Cultures, which came out in 2005. Critic and scholar Gayatri Gopinath asserts that, I quote Gopinath, within patriarchal diasporic and nationalist logic, woman and lesbian were configured as mutually exclusive categories and a threat to the very concept, the very principle of Indianness. So, being a lesbian and a woman was not something to be ashamed of, primarily because it was not even thought about. These were kind of invisibilized categories. It was unthinkable being a woman who is a lesbian. It was not talked about because it was unthinkable, unimaginable, and unmentioned. And this entailed that virtually it did not exist. Because if it did not exist at the level of common parlance, at the level of language, if it was semantically unavailable, it was something unspeakable, then the possibility of it being socially out there would be almost nil. So such a category as a woman and a lesbian is not discussed precisely because it is not expected to be out there on the main street. Therefore, the Canadian society in Mutu's story is basically imagined as a cultural mosaic where a figure such as the narrator, this unnamed narrator, her very presence on the street can disrupt the heteronormalcy. The unnamed narrator's Trinidadian culture, the baggage that she brings from various backgrounds, various lineage she is carrying, is shown as hybrid and heterogeneous in the first place. So, assigning one singular cultural identity to the narrator and her friend Janet is therefore not possible owing to its complicated nature. Their identities are complicated. Further, the relationship that Janet and the narrator share is also something quite complicated, and that it defies definition in a way. Although their roots lie in South Asia, they cannot be sweepingly categorized and identified as Indian. It's not as oversimplified as that. They carry, they carry a legacy from different countries. They have their roots, tracing back to different countries. In the Canadian multicultural society, the narrator can be ethnically categorized as a Hindu, Indo Trinidadian Canadian, whereas Janet can be described as a Protestant Indo Trinidadian Canadian. So that in a way encapsulates in one phrase their religion, their affiliations with different countries and so forth. However, despite such categorizations which are pretty complicated, these labelings are probably not adequate in capturing the nuanced ethnic, social, national and gender aspects that make up, that constitute these characters' identities. So from Shani Mutu's Out on Main Street, I would now move on to a short story written by Jhumpa Lahiri. It's titled Mrs. Sen. So Mrs. Sen is taken from the short story collection Interpreter of Maladies. Interpreter of Maladies was the first book written by Jhumpa Lahiri which won the prestigious Pulitzer Prize. Jayalakshmi Rao V states in her article titled Jhumpa Lahiri, A Perspective Interpreter of Maladies, I quote Lakshmi Rao, with a remarkable insight, she delves deep into the psychological depths of her characters and reveals their inner world by a fascinating yet deceptively simple style, unquote. So Lahiri depicts Indianness in an unusual foreign setting through Indian characters, food, costumes and habits. Her collection of 9 stories entitled Interpreter of Maladies speaks about the alienation and rootlessness that is experienced by the immigrants in the host land of America. In the same tone, Mrs. Sen is about the life of an Indian woman who has been transported to a society that is alien to her. She finds herself as a total misfit in the American society. In spite of her attempts to adjust to her surroundings, her sensitive soul seeks nourishment of the home. So she has been uprooted from her Indian culture and grafted into the American society by virtue of marriage. After marriage, she had to travel to America with her husband, and she finds herself in a very uncomfortable position, in a very unfamiliar position in a way, once she has to adjust with the American society. So, once she has to travel to America with her husband after her arranged marriage, she finds herself in a very uncomfortable position and feels that she needs to adjust a lot as a way of belonging to the American society. In the story, Mrs. Sen has newly immigrated to the United States after her arranged marriage to Mr. Sen, and Mr. Sen is a college professor of mathematics in the US. She constantly feels isolated upon her arrival, and she is missing her family in India. She also feels distant from her husband. This is because her husband is mostly busy with his work and remains outside of the home. He has his own academic engagements, which leaves this woman, the protagonist of the story, quite, in a lonely state, in a kind of she is almost in a solitary confinement in a new land. So, in this new land, Mrs. Sen strives continuously to preserve her Indian way of living through various means. So, as a way of retaining her Indianness, she is using these different props, these different kitchen practices or kitchen culture that ties her, that connects her to her native country. Her affinity towards her native country is reflected through her, habits and behavior. She dresses in an essentially Indian fashion. She puts a dot of vermilion on her forehead, and her taste for whole fresh fish that she cuts using an angular blade. In Bengali, it's called boti, and her traditional way of cooking and hospitality. All these, small things in her at the everyday level portray her as a traditional Bengali woman. Through these means, using this angular blade, her taste for fish, her way of cooking, her way of dressing and putting a dot of vermilion on forehead, all these things, make her feel that she's close to home. These are ways of overcoming her loneliness, her desolate status in the new land. So Lahiri brings out the loneliness and hollowness that Mrs. Sen is suffering throughout this story plot as a first generation immigrant in the US. She involves herself in cooking her Bengali food, which reminds her of her home back in Calcutta. To remain engaged in some activity, she decides to babysit a 12-year-old white American boy whose name is Elliot. And Elliot's mother is a working woman. Just like Mrs. Sen's husband does not have time for her owing to his other pressing engagements, Elliot's mother is also a working woman who cannot find enough time for the child. So Elliot is soon integrated into the Sen household and witnesses Mrs. Sen's loneliness and longing for her homeland. She is talking to this juvenile, this child, and she relieves her frustration through this conversation. One day, she asks Elliot, "If I begin to scream right now at the top of my lungs, would someone come?" She is so lonely that she is revealing to the child that she wants to scream at the top of her lungs. And she wonders whether anyone would even come to in response to her scream. She further tells Elliot that at home, all one needs to do is just raise one's voice a bit or express joy of any kind, and one whole neighborhood and half of another has come to share the news, to help with arrangements. So there are people to aid, to support you in times of emotional crisis. All you need to do in an Indian society is just scream, and you can have an entire neighborhood gathered around you, readily willing to help you. But not in America. The American neighborhoods are, eerily, uncannily quiet. There's that further amplifies and that further, in a way, exacerbates her loneliness. Mrs. Sen's loneliness, her feeling of desolation, and her problems of acculturation are reflected when she brings Elliot into her room and starts showing a kid all her saris that were stored away in her closet and drawer, and she starts telling him where she has ever worn the saris. So we see that this is a woman bereft of any companion in a new land, and she finds no one else but a little kid of 12 to whom she shows her sari collection, and she starts recounting where she wore each of them. So on another occasion, we find Mrs. Sen describing the silence of the US neighborhood as something disturbing, something eerie. She cannot sleep properly because silence bothers her a lot. She comes from a very normal, noisy, environment where people show their concern readily for one another, and she misses a sense of community in this alien land. For Mrs. Sen, Eliot is the go to person for sharing all her anguish, all her pain and angst. A wonderful companionship between two people, who are entirely different in terms of their age, in terms of their varying cultural backgrounds. And this companionship has been very beautifully depicted by Jhumpa Lahiri in her story. They develop an emotional dependence which binds them in the absence of their immediate family. Just like Mr. Sen is conspicuous by his absence, we see that Eliot's mother is also not present many times. So Clifford James Gird states in the article Diasporas, which was published in Cultural Anthropology, I quote, "Life for women in diasporic situations can be doubly painful, struggling with the material and spiritual insecurities of exile, with the demands of family and work, and with the claims of old and new patriarchies." Unquote. So, through this story of Mrs. Sen, through the loneliness depicted in Mrs. Sen's life, Jhumpa Lahiri basically documents the life of any Indian woman who is in a state of emotional exile. Here it is very interesting to note that Mrs. Sen's first name is never mentioned. She could be anyone, it doesn't matter. There is no one to call her by her first name. Our first name, that's what our first names are for. So she's so lonely that there is not a single person around her to call her by the first name. The reader never gets to know what's her name. She is reduced to Mrs. Sen. She is in a new land. Her designation is just that she is the wife of a professor. She is nothing more or less than that. So this anonymity falls heavily on her identity. It kind of crushes her, just becoming a no one, from being someone special, back in her own homeland, to becoming a no one, just a missus of someone, a wife of a professor who is forever busy. That kind of bitterness is reflected through the title of the story, Mrs. Sen, where the first name is forever absent. Similarly, we see that Mr. Sen's name is also not available. They are just playing a couple, they're just playing a husband and wife in a new land. There is no emotional excess in this relationship. They are just doing their day-to-day activities on a routine basis. And this kind of a routine life is kind of so suffocating, it almost engulfs the female protagonist's identity. So Mrs. Sen is a first generation migrant, a reluctant immigrant who travels to a new land for the sake of her husband's job, right? And there she gets reduced to just being someone's wife, sans her first name. Her nostalgic feeling towards her homeland, India, makes her so preoccupied that she keeps listening to the audio cassettes with recordings from her family back in India. And she tells Eliot, "Could I drive all the way to Calcutta?" She misses her home so much. The feeling of nostalgia persistently haunts the immigrants. This is reflected through this story. Eliot's mother is initially apprehensive about sending the child to Mrs. Sen's home. Earlier, we find Eliot had been looked after by a college student called Abby, and then by another lady called Mrs. Linden in their own home. However, in the case of Mrs. Sen, she convinces Elliot's mother by saying that our home is quite clean, quite safe for a child. Mrs. Sen is not able to go to Elliot's place to babysit him because she does not have a driver's license. So we see that this woman is really handicapped. She's crippled in terms of her social mobility also. Even when she learns to drive after much difficulty, she still wants to take a bus to travel and asks Mr. Sen to drive when she goes to buy her fish. So, all in all, we find that a woman like her finds it really difficult to adapt to a foreign land. Basically, Lahiri here is projecting and portraying how Mrs. Sen fails to adapt in an apparent multicultural American society. She finds no individual space, special space for her in this society where she can voice her own needs, where she can voice about her own choice, or where she can carve out her own individual living through likes and dislikes. With this, we come to the end of our lecture here today. Let's meet with a new topic in our next lecture. Thank you.